I told you I would be back later this evening. I did not lie. For those of you that joined me earlier today, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed that early afternoon stream as much as myself. Good evening. I am your host, Jason Miles, on another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are new to this channel, welcome. So glad to have you here. If you like what we're doing, please hit the like and subscribe button. It is a passive gesture that goes a long way. If you're a returning listener, subscriber, or one of our very valued patrons, fuck yeah. So glad to have you back. Just to remind you, this is listener-funded programming here on TIR, and we appreciate your viewership and support. Without y'all, we couldn't do this. Just a reminder that because of the uncensored nature of this show, we often get demonetized. So if you have the means and feel so inclined, consider becoming a patron. For as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year, you can access champagne rooms and our patron-only call-in shows. You get discounts on live events like our live show in SF. That's right. Patrons get a discount on the live ticket. Also, that $3 makes sure we can stay on the air. That being said, after the show tonight, we will be going into the patron-only champagne room where I want to have a conversation with y'all. MT posted something in the TIR group chat that I would like y'all to sound off on. So if you would like to join us, you're not sure about $3, is it worth it? Well, there's a free trial for you on Patreon. That's right. You can try us out for 7 whole days wherever you are watching or listening to the show. There are links in the description for becoming a patron. Now, let's talk about organizing, union organizing. And I was so excited to find out that our guest today is from the Bay Area. Just a shout out for that. We need more Bay representation on this show. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Eric Blanc, a historian, journalist, and organizer whose latest book, We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, provides a crucial analysis of the state of the labor movement in the 21st century. Blanc's work is a must-read for those of us seeking to understand how workers can rebuild power in an era dominated by corporate consolidation, political stagnation, and a fragmented workforce. Blanc's analysis arrives at a pivotal moment. The past few decades have been defined by the erosion of organized labor, the decline of civic institutions, and the rise a new Gilded Age where oligarchic power has only deepened its stranglehold on the political economy. During the 2020 George Floyd uprisings, we witnessed an enraged populace pushing back not just against police violence, but also against the systemic inequality embedded in capitalist institutions. Yet despite this mass upheaval, organized labor was largely absent as a cohesive force capable of channeling this energy into sustained counter-hegemonic power. As Blanc writes in We Are the Union, the crisis of labor is not just one of organization, it is one of imagination. We have been conditioned to accept the decline of worker power as inevitable rather than a challenge to overcome. Unquote. One of the key questions his book raises is, how do we build a truly counter-hegemonic movement in a time when work is more dispersed, workers are increasingly atomized, and the traditional factory floor has given way to a maze of logistics centers, gig work, and geographically scattered labor forces. The labor movement of the 1930s found strength in its concentration. Factories were hubs of working class life, and communities revolved around industrial centers. Today, however, workers spend hours alone in their vehicles, laboring in decentralized warehouses, coffee shops, and remote workspaces. This physical and social isolation has undoubtedly made organizing harder. Yet, Blanc does not see this as an insurmountable obstacle. Instead, We Are the Union details how worker-to-worker organizing offers a viable path forward. The labor movement's future, Blanc argues, will not be built by lobbying friendly politicians or waiting for institutional support. It will be forged by the hands of rank and file workers themselves. unquote. This peer-to-peer model of organizing seeks to empower workers directly, bypassing bureaucratic inertia and instead focusing on grassroots mobilization. The success of recent union drives at Starbucks, Amazon, and within the auto industry serve as evidence that even in the face of these logistical challenges, workers can still build solidarity and win major victories. Eric Blanc's, is it Blanc or Blank? He'll correct me when he gets on here. Eric Blanc's work reminds us that despite the immense obstacles facing labor today, worker-led movements are still capable of winning historic victories. If we are to challenge the entrenched power of this new Gilded Age, we must abandon the outdated notion that change will come from the top down. Instead, we must embrace the power of peer-to-peer organizing, where workers, not institutions, dictate the direction of the movement. Now, here to help me with this conversation, I have a friend of mine who works with labor notes. It's a lady, so you guys don't be guys. Please welcome Courtney Smith.
Hey guys.
Are you excited now? Did I get you fired up for the conversation?
That pumped me up. Now I'm ready to go.
And the man of the hour, Eric Blanc.
Hello.
Is it Blanc or is it Blanc?
Blanc.
It is Blanc.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it French?
They were Jews who fled Eastern Europe and ended up temporarily in France. I have like stolen French valor, even though I'm not really French.
That's why Pascal couldn't be here, because you're French. Just kidding. He's not that bad all the time. This was an interesting book because you mentioned some things that I've definitely brought up on this show. I've had conversation with my more activist friends. You bring up 2020 and the George Floyd protests. Where was labor during that time, in your opinion, when those things were going off?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by labor. If by labor you mean the unions, frankly, yes. The union movement has not positioned itself and did not position itself at that moment to be at the forefront of these battles, even if a lot of unions said the right things. So this is a step forward. It's fortunately, most unions didn't take like the wrong positions on it, but frankly, sure. Even if their positions are right, they didn't understand that this was the biggest protest in U.S. history, and that these were working class people in the streets, and that the role of the labor movement and the unions at the moments of the upsurge is to be out in the streets and to go all in and to give as much organization and solidarity as possible. And that happened occasionally. There's exceptions, but the norm was frankly press releases and continuing with business as usual. And that continued, frankly, over the course of the entire pandemic. The labor movement was really sort of caught flat-footed by the upsurges from Black Lives Matter and beyond. So yeah, I think the labor movement mostly missed the moment.
What should have been done, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, you saw examples of what was done. Partly, we can look at examples of labor action during the uprisings. You saw some bus drivers in Minneapolis refuse to transport cops, that you sort of transport the riot cops. You saw NBA workers go on strike. They're very rich workers, but they actually, this made a difference when they went on, refused to work because they were protesting the police brutality that they were seeing spreading. So you saw examples of what labor can do when it decides to act. And frankly, what the labor movement should have done as a whole is push towards getting its members out in the streets. At a minimum, we would have wanted to see like massive numbers of unions out with folks, on the streets, and then frankly, putting real pressure on politicians to make the types of policy changes that are necessary to provide an alternative to the over police state, because it requires not just reforms to the police, but it requires like a dramatic funding of social services and all of that. And those are things that, unions should have been already fighting for. And it provided a huge opening for labor to go on the offensive to say, yeah, now is the time. All of our communities are being underfunded. And for the most part, labor issued some statements, but it didn't really go all in on taking advantage of that moment and trying to give it momentum and solidarity.
And this kind of is for both of you guys. Has the disconnect between labor and broader social movements weakened the left's ability to fight capital? You want to take that part?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think to Eric's point on the labor movement kind of missing the moment during the Black Lives Matter uprising, what you've seen after Reagan, busted up unions in the 80s and this kind of bureaucratization of unions, the approach that they took to organizing workers was really this top-down, bureaucratic, really slow process of engaging with their members and only like utilizing their members as a way to mobilize and do protests and maybe, lobby some legislators to pass legislation or something, but they're not doing enough to build power, or it's not doing enough to sustain the building of power. And so for decades, labor has just been missing and has missed this, has created this disconnect from labor and workers and that their connection to the broader social environment that they are a part of. They became protectionary and only bargained for, bread and butter issues that only impacted their workers and didn't see them in the larger context of society, a part of their communities that they live in, and fighting on behalf of the communities that the workplaces are in. So you see this disconnect that happens with unions and the broader social movements. So yeah, by the time George Floyd comes around, labor just does not have the intuition to pick up on. They just don't even have the structures in place to bring in workers and really try to meet the moment.
Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, that's all true. I agree 100%. And I would add, though, one of the interesting things that happens despite the labor movement being MIA is that the Black Lives Matter protest played a central role in what came after, in essentially sparking, to a significant extent, the labor upsurge that we've seen. So for the book, I did a large-scale survey of every union drive that occurred in 2022. So we're talking about over 2,000 drives. I reached out to every single one of them and did a survey. And it turns out that the social movement that played the biggest role in inspiring them to organize their workplaces was Black Lives Matter. And so many people had gone to the protest, had gotten a sense of sort of a critique of society, and also just frankly a sense of hope and solidarity that pushing back can make a difference, because so many people in our daily lives, we just feel like nothing can change. And there was this moment where it felt like, oh, anything is possible. And that's a really powerful sentiment when you feel like you can act upon the world and not just be acted upon. And so that translated then into workplace organizing across the board in a lot of different industries. So to me, that's interesting that despite the sort of absence, for the most part, of labor unions, so many people took that energy into their workplace.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I do, this show has several critiques of the BLM movement, whatever you want to call it. But one thing that I think we can't deny is the fact that it did kind of change certain conversations. I never thought of it that way, but that is kind of interesting that BLM is kind of the fuel that gets certain engines going. Because another thing that we see is a lot of teachers' strikes after the Wildcat strike in West Virginia. And you talk about this in your book as well. And for me, I always point to West Virginia kind of as hope in a hopeless moment, because as you see behind me, I don't have a bookshelf to show how smart I am. I have posters behind me to show how much I'm dumb. I spent so much time traveling all over the planet playing these crazy shows, but one place I spent kind of an interesting amount of time in was West Virginia. And political opinions, racial makeup, kind of all over the board in that state. I think most people would call it a quote unquote red state, but the state as a whole, all the teachers kind of put their political beliefs aside and all went on strike for the greater good of the profession and ultimately for the greater good of their students. What is there to be learned from West Virginia, Eric?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the big lesson here is that workers have so much power that they don't mostly realize. This is a context in which you would have not expected workers to have won. The state that votes for Trump, the unions are very weak, Republicans in government. And nevertheless, they were able to force a very reactionary state government into granting major pay concessions and to sort of backtracking on its attacks on healthcare. And so the lesson is both that workers have this power and that the way to move in this direction is for rank and filers to take the lead. The union leaderships did not initiate these movements. They were initiated from below, from, teachers, some of whom were Bernie supporters, some of whom were in the southern region of the state where there's a mine workers tradition. People had kind of had their dads or their grandparents participate in strikes, and there was this sort of lineage of militancy. These teachers from below took the initiative. They formed Facebook groups and they sort of pushed the unions to eventually get on board. So there's a lesson there. And I think that for instance, the federal workers we're seeing right now are learning a lot. I'm trying to take inspiration from this because they're in a similar situation where they have to fight back even when their union leaderships are sort of still in lobby mode, and they have to be able to take these risks. It is a risk. Organizing is, it's not guaranteed to win. And if you're in the public sector where strikes are illegal, it was illegal in West Virginia. They didn't have the right to strike. It's illegal to strike in the federal sector right now. And so people are scared. But I think that maybe this is the last point just to flag, is that sometimes it takes a small group of people to get the ball rolling. Even when, most of your coworkers seem like they're just keeping their heads down and everyone is just too scared. It took a group of people to kind of take that risk and put their necks on the line and to do it. And it's a really heroic action. And it's not an easy action. That happened in West Virginia and they got the ball rolling. And I think it's starting to happen now in the federal workers sector as well.
Courtney, do you guys talk about West Virginia labor notes?
I'm not too hung up on the content or the players. We probably do. My coworkers are very smart people and they know all of the names, the dates, and the places. So yeah, I've definitely heard of the Red Strike in West Virginia and how that galvanized kind of more organizing happening in with teacher unions across the country.
Yeah. It was huge, right? In California, where I'm from, Los Angeles and Oakland teachers went on strike. Oakland teachers went on strike a couple times. I don't know if you have friends that are teachers in the Oakland Unified, Eric, but I know they did their second strike. They did. They were actually striking for better conditions, better housing conditions for some of their more underprivileged students, and they were kind of fighting for more environmental changes on the school grounds. That felt like that was part of that contagious moment that happens in 2018 to 2021. Is that moment gone where there's a public acceptance of these strikes as well, Eric?
I don't think the moment is gone. If anything, support for labor is higher than ever. Even under Trump, you have support for unions is higher than ever. And in many ways, the momentum that began with the teacher strikes in 2018 only spread. And so, it spread through Starbucks, it spread through Amazon, it spread through, frankly, just the revival of a labor movement. And I think you can really point to the teacher strikes as the first major instance of sort of wide-scale class struggle, and put the strike back out on the table, put workplace organizing back on the table. The pandemic obviously put a real wrench in organizing amongst teachers for sort of obvious reasons, because people were remote, and there was just sort of such a crisis moment that it became difficult for multiple years to talk about striking, or let alone anything other than just getting through the day. And I think, though, now that the pandemic, we're moving past that, the militancy of teachers is coming back. And frankly, it's more urgent than ever, because Trump, everything he's doing to the federal workers right now, next is going after higher ed, and K-12 is next. They're already talking about abolishing the Department of Education. So I think that the K-12 movement is going to have to bring back some of that 2018 West Virginia spirit if it's going to survive.
Now, I do want to kind of derail what I was going to ask next, because I do want to kind of follow up with this thing you bring up with Trump wanting to get rid of higher ed. Wouldn't you say he tried in 2016? Do you think Betsy DeVos wasn't up for the challenge and Linda McMahon is? Or do you just think there's a different moment around Trump right now and there's a different energy? Maybe he has more of a vision than he did in 2016.
I mean, I think they learned some lessons from 2016, from first round of Trump administration. And they saw that for them to impose their reactionary agenda across the country, they need to break the backs of the unions, right? Because it's not just a question of getting Betsy DeVos up on top. They need to have a mechanism to terrorize the workforce so much that the agenda from above can be imposed, even if it's illegal. And that's why they're going after the federal workers union so badly right now. And that's why they're doing all of this, like attempts to cut off funding. They have to terrorize people into submission. So I think that they saw how much the obstacle of workplace power and worker resistance was a real obstacle last time around. And so there's a reason they're starting with this right now. There's a reason that the major impetus and initiatives right now is to break the backs of public sector workers. And so, they're coming much harder. They're much more prepared. And it remains to be seen whether the labor movement's going to be up to the challenge of defeating it.
I mean, that was kind of part of the RNC. Is that what it's called? It's called the RNC, right? Their convention that they have, the Republican convention. One of the main talking points they had was this, I don't want to say their war on education, but I think what they were deeming as the left's war of indoctrination within public education, and why public education needs to be changed. So how do we counter these talking points? Because there's some realities around public education, especially if you live in a city that's filled with charter schools, a city like Oakland or New Orleans, for example. How do you counter these knocks, Courtney, when you hear these negative talking points about the perils of public education?
Oh man, in thinking about messaging, I mean, I think it's important to validate people's concerns about public education, and whatever issues that they bring up. I think it's important to just acknowledge that as their reality, and see how you can help them see the cracks in that a little bit. And so in thinking that charter schools are the answer, and we need to just privatize public education, we can point to examples of New Orleans, where the teaching conditions have declined rapidly. Like they're now all considered independent contractors, so nobody has protections there. You can be fired at any moment. And they can't keep, turnover rate is really high, so they can't keep teachers. So they're decertifying in some schools in order to eliminate competition and bring on more people that they could just throw in front of a classroom full of 30 students and teach the class. So I think you want to start, if you're going to challenge the messaging of somebody who, thinks charter schools are the answer, you want to start with their lived experience and kind of push back on it a little bit to question why they would think this is the solution when we have so many examples of how this has failed the public.
Eric?
Yeah, I think that's right. And you can just point to the reality, which is that the single best sort of indicator for what is going to make a school successful is whether it's sufficiently funded, right? So it's not, so you can acknowledge all of the problems in the public school system and be like, yeah, but look at the schools that are working. And it turns out that these tend to be schools that have a lot more money, and that correlates with being in richer, whiter districts. And so the question in some ways is simple, is like, the issue is, how do we sufficiently fund our schools so that we keep the best teachers, so that the classroom sizes are small enough? And so when you talk to people about that, then everyone, any parent would agree to that. And the question then becomes, well, how do you get that? Are charters going to provide that? No, it turns out the conditions in charter schools oftentimes are worse. The actual outcomes for students are even worse in these conditions. So there's no way out without just providing the funds necessary for students and teachers. And so that raises the political question of like why we're funding so many things other than these crucial services that ordinary people depend on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, kind of moving away from education, what similarities do you think exist between our current era and the original Gilded Age? Because this really feels like maybe even a different kind of Gilded Age, because Rockefeller was never president. I mean, I guess you could say Roosevelt comes from money, and Hoover, I believe, was pretty well off as well. But there's billionaires in positions of power in the White House, and this isn't the first time that happened, right? We had some billionaires in there the first time Trump came around, and people complained about it a little bit. Are people waking up to this Gilded Age fact? Do they not care about this Gilded Age fact because some of these people became millionaires so quick, and there is no industry other than tech and finance that came up in? And so this isn't like steel magnets that are building great buildings. These are people that sometimes just rigged a financial game to become gajillionaires. Does that fog our vision of the moment we're in?
I mean, I think if you look at the data and polling, and if you just look at sort of all the indicators we have, big corporations, including big tech, are extremely unpopular. And so it's not surprising that Elon Musk right now, with all of his crazy shenanigans and wrecking ball operations, is extremely unpopular. So it's not the case that working people sort of as a whole are looking sort of positively at these billionaires. If anything, I think there's a nakedness of the class structure under the Trump administration that and which is why the metaphor of the Gilded Age and sort of looking back at what this was like before is apt, because there is just a clear capture of the government by the richest people on earth. And I think, frankly, the administration, Trump, is playing with fire, because this is something that ordinary people, including many who voted for Trump, aren't on board with. So many people voted for Trump because they thought he was going to bring down the cost of eggs or whatever. They didn't want him to, bring on Elon Musk to destroy their social security. You know what I mean? Like, that's just like, it didn't even register in the discourse. And so I think the reality is that working people for decades now have felt like they've been getting short shrift, and that the bizarre irony is that the Democrats have been so bad on their own that it created space for Trump to be able to somehow portray himself as more anti-system, more anti-establishment than the Democrats. But now, like, he has to put up or shut up, and people are saying, oh, okay, like, what is he doing? Is he helping us? No. Is he helping the richest people? Yes. So I do think that the contradictions are extremely explosive. And it's a question now of whether people can feel like something can be done about it. And that's always the hardest part of organizing.
But would you say that there's a nihilism maybe in a younger cohort, let's say, that really hasn't seen anything work out for them politically? If you're, I don't know, 35, you want to say something? Because you're 35, you're 30 something. Sorry.
Yeah.
We shut up.
35.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I do think that's true. I mean, in thinking about the comparison between now and the Gilded Age, I think there is, you see these heightened contradictions between capital and the these disparities that it creates and the contradictions that it creates within capitalism. And so when you start to see that, these contradictions widen, it's really hard to continue to force, to try to make sense of like how things
like
are the way that they are. So
yeah.
yeah,
Labor's
exactly.
going to win for you because it won for your parents, but it hasn't won for you. It's like I asked that question not to be a naysayer, but I asked that question because it is one that actually goes through my mind quite a bit. When I just wrote this thing for Damage Magazine about young people and steroid use, and there is a kind of disassociation, a frustration. You teach, Eric. Is it hard? Do you see a hopelessness? And again, this isn't going to be everybody you talk to, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very contradictory. I would say that the discourse that just like young people are turning to the right is overstated. One of the things that I found in the survey I did of all of these drives. So this was just 2 years ago, 2022. This isn't 20 years ago. It's not 100 years ago. This is basically right now. Who was it that led these union drives across the board in 2022? It was young people. The average age was 27. 80% of the worker leaders were under the age of 35. So I think what you actually have is, because of the crisis of neoliberalism is so deep, there's so much dissatisfaction that cuts both ways. You have some people going hard to the right and being open to all sorts of crazy ideas. But then other people faced with the same sort of anti-systemic vibe and sort of similar, the center isn't holding, the center has no appeal. Well, then people are coming around to Bernie Sanders, democratic socialism, to the labor movement, Black Lives Matter. So I think that these aren't actually separate phenomena. These are both reactions to a deep delegitimization of the system. And I think that I'm relatively optimistic still, because young people, contrary to the sort of discourse, haven't as a whole turned to the right. 18% of young people voted for Trump in 2020, and 19% voted of the total potential voters, and 19% voted this time. So you're talking about a minority of the population. So there's some like minor trends, but then the reality is the vast majority of young people are progressive or radical or just disenchanted and don't vote whatsoever.
Would you say more?
Let me.
Go ahead. I'll shut up.
No, yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to what I was saying earlier and lift up Eric's point here about kind of nihilism can, in cutting both ways of just like how to make sense of the system and your environment and what's going on. And so you do see a lot of people who, maybe I think capitalist forces really does create this response in us to either, to feel hopeless about our conditions and doing anything about it. So I think that's the nihilism that we see. But then there are also just other ways that elites really disorganize us and fill us with fear and confusion and doubts. And so we really push back on the idea that people don't care about things. They definitely do. They just figure out a way to explain the issues that they're experiencing in some other way, whether it's internalizing it and I just got to do yoga 6 days a week and now I can be more productive at work or something, or they find another group of workers to blame for why they don't have a larger piece of the pie. Or they just don't see their union doing anything about it. They don't have any other way of knowing themselves other than an individual, and unions aren't stepping up to the plate to fill that void. So it's hard for workers to see any path forward, any way for them to actually work together to push towards solutions to the issues that they experience.
Well, let me ask both of you this question. How does the decentralized nature of modern work, because I think this has something to do with what we're talking about, i.e. gig economies, logistics networks, remote work, pose challenges to organizing?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, it's clearly like a harder task to organize when workers are spread out than when they're concentrated. So in the 1930s, so many workers worked in these huge factories and lived next to their coworkers, next to the factory. And so you had these pre-existing dense relationships that unionization could tap. You didn't have to sort of foster the relationships to the same extent as you have to today. So today you have sort of an additional task, which is not just to get people to get over their fear of the boss, but it's to get them to see themselves as part of a broader collective and to see that they have the same interests as their coworkers. So yeah, that's harder if you live really far. So for instance, in Amazon, I live in New York City. People who work at JFK 8 in Staten Island, people are commuting 2-3 hours sometimes all over, from everywhere to get there. So it's hard if you're so dispersed everywhere out. And that's actually the norm in a lot of these jobs, is people are commuting really far. And then the jobs themselves, as you mentioned, a lot of jobs themselves are disaggregated. People are working remote. Okay, so it's true that's an obstacle. But the more interesting point to my mind is that despite that, people are overcoming those obstacles. One of the things I found in the research for the book is that so many people unionized remote work, even they had never met each other before, but they were able to use digital technology in a way that I wouldn't have intuitively thought was possible. They were organizing over Zoom. I had people say, they've been organizing for 2 years with the organizing committee. They feel like these are close comrades and friends. They never met in person, so that's not ideal. But if you're working in a nationwide company like some of these were, in which you just literally are never going to work in the same workplace as your coworker, well, then you have to do that. And I take some inspiration and sort of hope that even in these hard circumstances, people have found a way to build connections.
Well, I mean, your book and Natasha Hakimi Zapata's book, I felt were a few hopeful texts that I've read so far this year, in my year of booking people with long ass books. But seriously, it's kind of that contradiction you're talking about. Are young people maybe more nihilistic? Possibly, but they also are used to talking to each other, not in real life. It's probably easier to. Do you find that, Courtney, that when you're dealing with a younger cohort, that it's easier for them to organize and work together through Zoom and other social media apps?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the kind of interesting obstacle we've, come across in trying to figure out how to reach workers and how to, bring more people into our side of the labor movement is this distinction between white collar workers and blue collar workers. I think is probably more so maybe an obstacle in terms of like blue collar workers not using email as much for work and not being familiar with Zoom and these different sort of platforms that that younger generations use in order to organize. So we do see that kind of obstacle in bringing people in a remote way. But there are a lot of examples of remote organizing or workers who are extremely atomized and alienated from each other, and how they were able to overcome those obstacles by using these technology tools.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably useful just to flag that it's not either or. Like one of the things that I found in the book is that you can use these tools to facilitate in-person organizing. So just to give a really concrete example, like at Starbucks, they won a first union election in Buffalo, New York. Hundreds of baristas all across the country reached out over email to say, hey, how did you do this? And those baristas jumped on a Zoom call to train other workers all across the country. But those workers who reached out then had to go talk with their coworkers in person. You know what I mean? So they were getting trained online, but the actual organizing they were doing was very much in person with their coworkers. So there's a way of doing the best of both worlds, where I don't think that the solution is just to like fully rely on social media, because there is something about the deep one-on-one conversations and things like that. So you don't want to like throw the baby out with the bathwater. But what's cool about social media, I think, is more that it allows workers across the country and across regions to connect with each other in a way that wasn't possible prior. So it allows a level of training of workers to other workers that is new and exciting.
Eric, can you explain to people what peer-to-peer organizing is? I know you spent a whole chapter explaining it in the book.
Yeah.
But can you, the abridged version?
Yeah. So the abridged version is that in staff-intensive union organizing, the norm is you have one staffer for like every 100 workers you're trying to organize. It tends to cost about $3,000 per every worker you're trying to unionize. And the problem is it's just too costly to scale. You can't organize millions of workers this way. So worker-to-worker organizing, or as you call it, peer-to-peer organizing, it has three things that distinguish it, but the meta point is basically that workers are taking on the role that traditionally is done by staff, and that takes three forms. One is who's initiating the campaigns. In a worker-to-worker approach, it tends to be workers themselves are initiating it, not staff. Who is training other workers? So in a worker-to-worker approach, it tends to be workers, as I described at Starbucks, are training other workers, and it's not a staffer training the new drives. And then the third is strategy. In a staff-intensive organizing approach, it tends to be staff and full-timers who are making the big decisions about what to do. And maybe workers get to do some of the small tactical stuff, but it's really staff are coming up with the big strategy. Worker-to-worker approaches, workers themselves are central players in coming up with, what should be done, what are the tactics, what are the strategies, what are the risks that are necessary. And so we've seen that across the board. The biggest wins of the last 3 years have been worker-to-worker, really in all industries.
How do you encourage people with peer-to-peer organizing, Courtney, in labor notes?
We really, that's our whole approach, is our rank and file strategy, and building democratic unions to create mechanisms, or to use the mechanisms that unions already have in place in order to bring in more workers, to really do the work of the union, and participate in the union as fully as possible, so that you have this kind of engagement, this constant engagement and feedback loop between the workers and the leadership. And so when you're at a negotiation table and you're bargaining, on behalf of your workers, you are speaking the language of your workers because you've been in conversation with them. And they ideally are at the table, during bargaining sessions, and they're participating in that process. And you're really building power along the way as you engage and do this worker-to-worker organizing.
Speaking of this peer-to-peer organizing, you have a lot of examples from Starbucks in the first few chapters of the book. A lot of quotes from people in those union drives. Why is it so easy for Starbucks and so difficult for McDonald's?
Yeah, that's just a question. I wouldn't say it's so easy at Starbucks. They've had to it's true that it's been easier for it to pop off, but they went up against a terrorization campaign. So Starbucks has done everything possible to squash its workers, and they've succeeded despite that. So, and I would say that nobody thought this was possible. So in the same way that nobody thinks that McDonald's is possible, if you had asked any labor organizer, including a lot of leftists, 5 years ago, whether you could have unionized Starbucks and forced, the sixth largest private employer to the bargaining table like they've done now by organizing over 550 stores, people say it's not possible, that the stores are too dispersed, that there's too much turnover, that young workers just don't care. And so that turned out to be wrong. And so I do think that it's a little hard to know ahead of time what places are possible to organize and not, without actually trying it. That being said, there's specific reasons why Starbucks popped off first. I would think, frankly, one of the most important is that there is a certain culture of types of workers that get jobs at Starbucks tend to be queer and maybe a little bit more progressive because of that. Starbucks has a reputation for being a queer-friendly place, so particularly outside the big cities, this is one of the few places you can work and be out if you're gay or queer or trans, whatever. And so that had a certain sort of cohesion factor for the types of workers are at Starbucks than already maybe a little bit more left-leaning. So that's part of it. And then I think related to that, workers had higher expectations from the company. It's not the case in labor organizing that just the worse things get, the more workers rise up. If anything, when you have a really, really shitty job, then sometimes you just don't think it could ever be better. You don't expect a McDonald's job to be a little better necessarily. And so you're just sort of doing it and you're just trying to get through the shift in a way that people thought Starbucks was a better employer. Starbucks has this reputation for caring about its employees. And then when that started to be shown to be not the case during COVID, and as the company sort of rolled back some of its older, more paternalistic programs, I think that really was a really explosive dynamic then, because people felt betrayed. I talked to so many workers, and I quote some of them in the book, who worked there 15 years, 8 years, and who really believed in the company. And then when they saw that the company was lying to them and was treating them like garbage, well, it's like realizing your dad was an axe murderer or something. It was really that sense of betrayal. That's how
it was the number one company, right? Howard Schultz was the CEO to look at and how to run a company. I worked at a Starbucks in San Francisco in 2007 or so downtown. It definitely wasn't the worst job I've had, not even close to it. But there's this weird disconnect, because we're finding more and more out about fast food, especially in the last few years post-COVID. Laws are even being changed to roll us way back. These are like, pre-New Deal stuff. Like, why not have the kids work? They have such adorable little fingers that fit in these machines. They don't need sleep. And we see a lot of this in factories in the South, but we're seeing some of this in fast food. So what is it about? Is it just the way we look at fast food? Because is this really, because I want to ask this question, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of anything that Starbucks has done. Help me understand this. Or is this a bit of a class thing, and we're kind of dismissive on the whole of fast food labor? Or is it really just that much harder to break through on the fast food side when it comes to organizing?
Yeah, you want to go, Courtney? I can go after you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think which. Yeah, what's the question that you have, Jason? Are you asking?
I'm asking.
Go ahead.
Is there a certain bourgeois sensibility that we have towards Starbucks, their employees, the workplace, that we don't have towards fast food? Is this just a job for the poor?
I think I understand. I think I understand what you're asking. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that as a way that people kind of understand the Starbucks organizing versus fast food workers organizing. I mean, Starbucks does serve more of a middle class maybe population. They're more in, these gentrified areas that
I mean, everybody knows what a frappuccino is. I can go to any hood in America. Eric said he's in New York.
We got the white girls with their pumpkin spice cups, and the bougie
right now. Yeah, somebody knows what a frap is.
Starbucks represents a lot of things bougie, so I can definitely see people, maybe perceiving the Starbucks organizing in that way versus fast food workers organizing. But I think a part of the issue is that these stories just aren't being lifted up, because there is fast food workers who are doing organizing, and that are really making some gains. There's the United Southern Service Workers, that's in the South, that's kind of comes out of SEIU, and they're doing a lot of organizing. Fast food workers, particularly the Waffle House workers, McDonald's, Dollar Tree, these sorts of franchises that are really dispersed and atomized, and have low wage workers that are working for poverty wages and in some violent conditions. I mean, Waffle House has been in the news how many times for
No, you said, look, if you're organizing a Waffle House and you are not some sort of Clint Eastwood Blade type figure, I don't know what to tell you, because the Waffle House, Eric, I don't know if you've ever spent time at a Waffle House. See, even I don't know what it is about that place, but past a certain hour, there is nothing like being in a Waffle House, because you are going to see a show. So if you're organizing in a Waffle House, you have my blessing.
Yeah. No, I mean,
yeah.
to your point, like we can joke about it, but it's a real serious problem for workers on the job. There's, there's a story we had on a panel one time about violence on the job or in the workplace. And we had a Waffle House worker who talked about seeing one of his coworkers get shot and killed in a Waffle House in a dispute. And management, didn't obviously closed the place down. They continued to run and just replace the worker who got shot with someone else. So yeah, that's a serious problem for workers in Waffle Houses. On top of not getting paid enough, on top of meals being taken out of their check and wages being stolen, shitty scheduling. Yeah, the conditions in these workplaces are really bad. So it makes it really hard for workers to want to organize or to think that they can organize, especially with the high turnover rate. These places tend to be a bit harder, but there is some organizing that's happening in fast food places. We just don't hear about it in the media.
Well, you talked about it. You said Burgerville. That's a fast food place, right, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, and so I think what Courtney says is right, though. Sometimes people just haven't heard about the stories. But one of the biggest union campaigns, and it wasn't exactly a unionization drive, was the Fight for 15, which SEIU supported. So you did have thousands of strikes in fast food. So it shows that workers, including McDonald's, were fighting back. I have criticisms of the way SEIU sort of organized this. It was a little bit top down, whatever. But it shows that there's a lot of workers who in these in these companies who are willing to fight back. And as you mentioned, in the book, I actually start with a profile of a campaign in fast food, Burgerville, which is a smaller chain, but demographically, it's like mostly young Black and brown workers in the Pacific Northwest. It's not like, it's not a bougie place. And they won a first contract, and they did it through a really bottom-up way. They didn't wait for the law to change. They didn't even wait for established unions to come and organize them. They were wobblies, sort of anarcho-syndicalists, IWW, and they took the initiative. And they won, and it took them years. It took them 5 years to get a first contract. They started organizing in 2016, got a first contract in 2021. So it's not easy, but they had strikes. They had multiple strikes. They had a boycott. They got the community on board. And so it shows you that even in these types of jobs that everybody said was impossible, and I include these quotes, from the union. They said everybody told us this was impossible. This is after the day they win their election, and then the day they win their contract. Everybody said it was impossible. We showed it was possible, and so I think that's kind of the spirit we need to have: is that there's no job that is intrinsically unorganizable. Any job can have a union, no matter what the law says, no matter what the bosses tell you, because a union is just workers coming together to fight for their rights. That's really all a union is. And so I do think we need to kind of put away this idea that there's certain places that are unorganizable. It's really a question of how you organize it and how you get workers to have the confidence. And things can catch on fire when you least expect it. Nobody would have expected Starbucks to catch on fire. There was no plan to organize Starbucks nationally. They organized one shop in Buffalo thinking that it was going to be like a small regional thing, and it caught fire. And we don't know what's going to be like at McDonald's when they win their first election. We don't know what's going to be like at Waffle House when they win their first union election. So I think we have to have confidence in people's ability to fight back.
And to that point. Oh, sorry, you want to say something, Courtney? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I guess to Eric's point about, unions are really just workers that are coming together to act in accordance with one another. I mean, there's other examples of workers who aren't in unions who organize and come together to fight back against their boss and really make material gains in their workplace. And again, those aren't the stories that we hear about, and they're not, quantified within, how we think about and know the labor movement and understand unions, because they weren't a part of any institutional structure. But there's workers do fight back. There are plenty of examples in unorganized workplaces of workers fighting back. There's EWOC, who's taking on the mantle of trying to help those workers organize and fight for a union.
What is
and
EWOC?
so those sorts of stories.
What is EWOC?
Yes,
It's
EWOC
not a
is
furry, like a Wookiee? No.
No.
Nobody from Indoor?
Close, maybe. No. EWOC, it stands for Emergency Workplace Organizing. So this was kind of a digital strategy toolkit or it served as a digital strategy toolkit during the pandemic when there was this labor upsurge and workers were looking for, what to do during the pandemic. EWOC started from just, I think, leftist volunteering, and then kind of expanded, and I think has added on a couple of staff to support the work, but they've really grown in establishing these digital tools that can help workers learn how to organize their workplace and establish a union, get established with a union.
Eric, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. And I just want to let everyone know, wherever you are watching or listening to this show, there are links in the description to Eric's book, We Are the Union. This book was very hopeful. Every chapter, no matter what you're saying, you always end on kind of a high note. I want to end this show on a high note. As you and I were talking a little bit off air, it's kind of a dark day. We don't need to get into it too much now. But what can we do to continue to try to organize our workplaces? How can we on the left have some hope during this administration where people feel somewhat hopeless? Help us out a little bit here, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people are overly gloomy, which is to say that people exaggerate the extent to which Trump is like unstoppable and all powerful, and that we're on like an inevitable slide to fascism. All of these things, obviously, there's a lot of truth to, and to say nothing of the horrors that we just saw today in Gaza. So there's a lot of reason to be like extremely sad about the state of the world. But the reality is that the Trump administration is playing with fire and is imposing a set of policy sort of pushes that are extremely unpopular. When you start taking away people's Social Security, when you start talking about privatizing that, when you start talking about cutting Medicaid, when you take away basic regulations that people took for granted, like, do you eat food? Well, it turns out if there's nobody to enforce, the USDA, who's going to keep companies from poisoning your food? Do you breathe the air? Well, who's going to enforce that the companies aren't just polluting the air? These things that are like taking us back a century. Ordinary people, no matter who they voted for, don't like it when their lives get worse. Trump is making their lives worse. And I think that this creates a huge opening for the labor movement to fight back. And the Democrats certainly aren't doing it. Like we've seen this. So the labor movement actually at this point is the best positioned to raise the mantle of like economic dignity, democracy, both at the workplace and the political sphere. And I think it's a winnable struggle. I think that the fights that we're seeing right now at the Federal Unionist Network and the federal workers who are fighting back to talk about save our services, let us work, like this is something I think can galvanize people. Think about just like veterans. They're talking about cutting 80,000 jobs from the VA. Like, who's that? Like, who's going to support that? Really, like, the veterans who put their lives on the line now aren't going to be able to get basic, decent care. Well, I think this is something that you can organize around. Like, imagine in every city, and this is starting to happen, people are organizing protests, civil disobedience to save the VA. Same with Social Security. Like, get a bunch of old people, riled up and get them, put their, wheelchairs and get them in there into the Social Security offices. Say like, no, don't take this away from us. I think that this is a possibility that the labor movement can lead on, so it's workplace organizing, but in conjunction with the community. There's a campaign that people can sign up for, savepublicservices.com, that the Federal Unionist Network has launched, basically a mass action campaign to save these services. And so if you're out there, I say, sign up for that, find out where your local actions are, go or support those. And I think Musk is very, very, Musk is a liability for Trump.
Yes.
Elon Musk is so sort of cartoonishly evil and so cartoonishly just self-serving and crazy, frankly, that even though a lot of right-wingers don't like him. So I think we have an opportunity to like take him down, force so much backlash against Musk that Trump sort of throws him to the wolves. And if we're able to do that, that would be a huge gain for democracy and for like saving the public sector. And I think that that is something that we can do over the next few weeks, but it requires people like not just checking out and feeling like, their
Yeah.
political hibernation for the next 10 years. It takes it going back into the streets and getting organized.
Courtney, you want to add something? A message of hope?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll do my best. I mean, the thing that I appreciate the most about, learning the story of labor is you're really learning about this formation of capitalism and the resistance to the formation of capitalism. And so you learn about the, everyday people who were empowered to fight back and didn't just accept things, conditions as they were. So I think, one thing that I'm trying to do in this moment is really ground myself that I'm a part of a longer tradition, that, we've been here before. There are, pathways that we chose to take back then that we can learn from. There are different choices that we have now, different tools at our disposal. And so there are ways that we can fight back against Trump, and that we can learn from our history and from past fights. And Eric putting together this great book for us to reflect on and learn from. But yeah, I mean, we're a part of a longer tradition of resisting. So, this isn't a moment to run and hide and go into protection mode. Unions can really act as that counterbalance of force to really move humanity forward in the direction that we, want society to go in. So I'm hoping, I'm seeing glimmers of hope that labor might be stepping up to the moment, but we'll see. It's, still yet to be determined.
I wrote a couple years ago that Trump was having his Chinese democracy moment. So if anyone here is a Guns N' Roses fan, you probably know that reference. I think the Democratic Party definitely kicked the door open for him. But that being said, if pop culture is any sort of metric, for the first time in quite some time, Joe Rogan is not the most popular podcast in America. It is an anti-Trump podcast, which has come out of nowhere. That is the #1 show in the country. So maybe that means something. That being said, wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there are links in the description to Eric's book, We Are the Union. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you so much for reaching out. I wouldn't have known to contact you. I would have tried to contact a publicist and sent an email to no one. So I appreciate you so much. I really do. And I hope to bring you back on. Maybe we can, if you're down, we can talk a little punk rock in the 90s if you're down.
That sounds great. That sounds like a very wholesome episode. And thanks, Courtney, for being on. And appreciate it, Jason. Appreciate all your work.
Thank you, guys.
Good to talk to you, Eric.
If you're not let's send Eric off. Courtney is going to join me in the champagne room where we will.
Oh, is it just us?
It's just us.
Eric got it.
He has to keep his
okay.
Job.
Yeah.
The
Understandable.
The climate is way too hot for teachers right now. Even if you are a lefty teacher, the climate is too hot. We're going to talk a little dating etiquette in the champagne room. If you know me personally,
this conversation,
then you're like, Jason, you can't talk shit about dating etiquette because we know you personally. And you're a douche. That being said, get ready. The link's already up if you're a patron. If you're not a patron, there's the links in the description to the show. Become one. Enjoy this conversation with us. I know the chat is going to have so much to say. When I read them, this thing is going to set everything off. Steve, so this is going to be your last time on the show in the champagne room. Maybe not. But thank you guys. And where's the music at? We are out.